Today I wanted to play the same 50 games on Switch and Steam Deck. Now, you might be thinking, well, obviously the Steam Deck is gonna win. Well, actually no. If you're talking about pure performance, then yeah, the Steam Deck will probably win. But that's not the only thing that contributes to a good gameplay experience. Games are optimized differently, controls can be wildly different, and of course, we gotta test which one's better. So let's jump in right away and look at a game like Borderlands 1. Right away we see the frame cut from 60 to 30 on Switch. The depth of field is completely lost, foliage like plants are missing as well. Although some textures are worse, the Switch is sharper in docked because the resolution is increased in docked mode. So even textures on Claptrap are better on the Switch version. The lighting is also different with the shadows being deeper and the graphics overall better, and having a first-person shooter like this, having 60 frames is better than 30 frames. I think the PC version of Borderlands 1 is just so old and hasn't been updated in a while. But still, Steam Deck takes this one due to the frame rate. Borderlands 2. I expect this to run similar to the first one, but we'll see. The Switch version supports gyro controls, but technically so does the Steam Deck. Textures on the Steam Deck are far better and clearer. Once again, the frame rate is cut in half on Switch, and the depth of field is like the first game where it's non-existent on Switch. Since this game has pretty forgiving graphics, if you don't mind the basic depth of blur effects or frame rate, you can choose either. But the Steam Deck for this game is the one I'd recommend. Borderlands the Pre-Sequel. Borderlands Pre-Sequel is the best looking and feeling game on the Switch, out of all the games in the Legendary Collection. Unlike the first two, the Switch version actually has an apparent depth of field this time, and runs at a pretty solid 30 frames per second. And looking over at the Steam Deck, it's not running as smooth as the first two, running at a high 50 with some dips down to 40 with max settings. That might not be great for you if you want a steady frame rate, but you can turn the settings down and get a better frame rate on Steam Deck, which you can't do on the Switch. We'll find that a lot of the Switch games can't actually be changed at all in the settings. But aside from the higher frame rate, the better textures does make the Steam Deck version a touch better. Both are great options though. If you want a better performance overall, the Steam Deck just beats this one. And all these Borderlands games do have local split screen. Both versions can do it, but it's far more convenient on Switch due to the dockability, which might completely change your mind on what version to get it on. There's one Borderlands game that doesn't have local split screen, and that's the latest, Borderlands 3. This is a game that I feel nobody expected on Switch, but several years later they finally worked up the courage to port it. Side by side, you can see that they're both targeting 60 frames per second, shockingly. At high settings, the frame rate on Steam Deck gets just under 60, but can be locked at medium settings. The Switch tries really hard to get at 60 frames per second, but often finds itself between 25 and 45. The overall lighting and shading is also lowered on Switch, and most textures and foliage is straight up removed or replaced. Hands down better on Steam Deck. And if you want, after this video, you can check out my full in-depth review on Borderlands 3 on Nintendo Switch. Bioshock Remastered. First things first, in Bioshock 2, the menu is a little different. The brightness slider on Steam Deck version is broken for some reason. I don't know why. But the main thing is the textures and frame rate are much better on Valve's Steam Deck. Steam Deck wins this one. Bioshock Infinite. With the graphics settings all at normal, the Switch version and Steam Deck version are mostly similar aside from the frame rate. The only other difference is the colors being a tad washed out on the Switch. After getting to a more populated area with grass, the frame rate chugs a tad on the Switch, and the dynamic resolution was lowered. Even the shadows were lowered. There's pop-in, but it's on both systems, and the textures are significantly clearer on the Steam Deck. Overall, for a game like this, it's best enjoyed on the Steam Deck. But if you don't care about frame rate, it's just fine on Switch. Among Us. Can you tell which one is which? Exactly, and me neither. There doesn't seem to be a difference between the two except the gyro features on the Switch. The games play identical with this super simplistic game, and it's even cross-play with other versions. Personally, I'd play the Switch because it's more convenient. Hot Wheels Unleashed. Load times are significantly better on the Steam Deck, but once you're in a race, the gameplay feels pretty identical, with the graphics just being much better on Steam Deck. And if we look at the same car model, you can also see much clearer reflections and sharper lines. The resolution is also at 720p docked on Switch, whereas we can easily get the Steam Deck to 1080p, 60 frames per second connected to a display. On both versions, we have the option to turn on AMD FSR, which should upscale the resolution to increase the frame rate. After turning that on, you can't see a noticeable change in frame rate, but you can in the resolution. I would personally keep it off on the Switch version. It just doesn't look as good to me. On the Steam Deck, we managed to hit 60 frames per second using high presets with the FSR quality mode. So even the graphics and performance are better on Steam Deck. But the Switch's local multiplayer makes this version superior to me. We need to remember how easy it is to play with friends on the Switch. So the Switch takes this one for me. Siberia. These were old school point and click games on PC, and now they're on Switch. But how does it run compared to the Steam Deck? The Siberia games technically aren't compatible on the Steam Deck, but doing some tinkering, we were able to get it running. On the Switch version, in the opening cutscene, there is very odd hitching. Actually, the entire game just seems to run pretty bad. Constant dips and slow working things. The character is overlaid in the game scene on the Switch version, but doesn't seem to be on the Steam Deck version. On the Steam Deck version, the lines are jaggy, and there are no buttons or stick controls, so you have to use the point and click control scheme. And although the story might be intriguing, I won't play it long enough to find out what's happening. But comparing the two versions, the Switch easily wins this one due to the better controls. Now the second one. The same thing with Siberia 2. The Switch opening cutscene is barely playable, and it's even pre-rendered. Everything wrong with the first game is here, with constant hitching and annoying controls on Steam Deck. The Switch is still better because of the controls and the noticeable difference in in resolution. Crash Insane Trilogy. Both versions of Crash Insane Trilogy run amazing. The Switch version runs at a solid 30 and the Steam Deck runs at a solid 60 frames per second, and the PC version is the only way to get 60 frames per second in this game. Not even other console versions like the PlayStation or Xbox can get 60. Textures and resolution look way better on the Steam Deck, even the text on the levels are way lower. So yeah, the Steam Deck wins this one, unless you want it physical like your boy. Stardew Valley. Due to the unbelievably simple art style this game has, the graphics and performance is identical, but with the Steam Deck version, you can easily add mods and stuff like that. Personally, I'd prefer to play the Switch version solely because of the local multiplayer. Playing this game with a close friend or a special someone is just completely game-changing and adds a lot more enjoyment to it, especially if you're in the same room. And this game does support local multiplayer, so this one easily goes to the Switch for me. Doom! First of all, I can't believe this game even runs on Switch. Not only does it feel kind of like a non-Switch game, but it just stands out next to the typical catalog of games for the system. First thing you'll know about the frame rate on the Steam Deck is that it's 60 in 720p, absolutely flawless. Unlike the Switch's smooth 30, which rarely dips in docked mode, load times are way better on Steam Deck, and the shading and reflections are better too. When you're dashing around in a game like this, blasting away demons, the higher frame rate on Steam Deck takes the cake. The Switch version just feels slower to move around, and if you're in love with gory kills, some of that's less detailed on the Switch version. But this is quite an impressive port on Switch. Still, hands down, giving it to the Steam Deck. Subnautica, another one of those unexpected ports. While the Steam Deck version is running around 45 frames per second, on high at 720p. On the Switch, it was a choppy 30 frames per second with some jagged edges, and load times were so much longer on Switch. The draw distance on Switch specifically was substantially worse than on the Steam Deck. Still not great on Steam Deck though, but you can change it with a bit of tinkering. With the overall graphics and performance, it looks like Steam Deck is going to take this one as well. Subnautica below 0. The Steam Deck seems to be running the game around 45 to 60 frames per second, which is better next to the Switch's unstable 30. The textures on the rocks and waters are downgraded on Switch alongside the lighting. Even some shadows are completely missing, and the resolution is even worse on Switch, looking lower than 720p. And there's a massive texture difference, especially with these in-hand items. The game has some serious pop-in on Switch, but there's still some minor pop-in on the deck. But Subnautica below 0 seems to run better than the first game on the Steam Deck, but worse than the first game on Switch. I'm giving this one to Steam Deck. Terraria. Did you even know Terraria was on Switch? Well, it is. The simple graphics are pretty much identical, with the Switch having the console layout, but the load times are way better on Steam Deck, as we've come to expect. On the Steam Deck, you could probably install mods, and the best thing about the Steam Deck version would be using the trackpad or keyboard and mouse, which would make the game way easier to control. So this point goes to the Steam Deck unless you like using the controller. The Switch version does have local co-op, so if you plan on playing local co-op, then the Switch would probably be a better option for you. But because of the controls, I prefer Steam Deck. Amnesia: A Dark Descent. With this horror game, it's kind of hard to determine which one is graphically better, because of the weird visual effects this game constantly has on screen, and you can't shut these effects off in the Switch version. The graphics and lighting look identical to me, but the main thing is, of course, the frame rate. The frame rate makes the Steam Deck version feel way better due to the constant screen effect. The Switch version looks extremely choppy because of this, so point Steam Deck. Monster Hunter Rise. The frame rate is doubled on the Steam Deck version with a higher overall resolution, and when seeing monsters in the distance, there's frame cutting on Switch. But honestly, this one is the best optimized game on the Switch, but still, I would give this one to the Steam Deck. It's just so much smoother. Since this doesn't have cross-platform play, you should just choose whichever one your friends have, assuming you want to play multiplayer. But this still goes to Steam Deck. Valkyria Chronicles. This game is essentially graphically identical. The biggest difference is the frame rate. It's 60 on the Steam Deck and 30 on the Switch. What also might be helpful is the touchpad on the Steam Deck, which will help you aim and is better than a small Joy-Con stick. Really, with this sort of gameplay, the frame rate doesn't matter too much, so just pick whichever one you prefer, or, can find it on sale. Valkyria Chronicles 4. For this sequel, the colors are visibly more washed out on the Switch, especially in these flowers. The Switch version is at a noticeably lower resolution as well, and the frame rate is once again cut right in half. And ditto the things I said for the first game. But since the Steam Deck does look a little bit better this time around, I'd say get that one. Assassin's Creed 2. The frame rate on the Steam Deck version is better, but the shadows are actually way better on the Switch, being stable when you're close, and when you walk away on the Steam Deck version, the shadows get jaggy. And when you look at the pillars, it actually looks like the textures on Switch are better and updated. And there's also a really weird bloom effect on the Steam Deck version, which doesn't exist on the Switch, and it looks better without it. I'd actually give this one to the Switch, as it seems the developers polished this one to run flawlessly on this console. Ghost Runner. Jumping into the game, well, after it took forever to load on Switch, some particle effects are completely gone, and most reflections, like on the sword, are gone as well. And the resolution is still incredibly low on the Switch version. And of course, the frame rate is cut from 60 on the deck to 30 on the Switch. The Joy-Cons also make this game a little difficult to play due to the high sensitivity of the camera, and the 30 frames per second make it difficult to even see what you're doing on Switch. This one is easily better on the Steam Deck. Maneater. The frame rate, like most games, is double on the Steam Deck with a higher resolution. Compared to the color on both, it's widely different, with the Switch version looking foggy and washed out. The textures on boats and water water are also noticeably worse. Increasing the graphics on the Steam Deck, it runs just above 30, but there is so much more detail underwater, like the sunken ship. Definitely looks better on the Steam Deck, so that's probably where you'll want to play it. War Groove. The opening cutscene looks, that doesn't really look that nice. Looks like the colors on the opening video is separated on Steam Deck, whereas it looks perfectly optimized in the Switch version. Getting into gameplay, it all seems fine. In fact, it's identical. The only thing that makes the Switch version a little more epic is the physical release. It comes with a map, soundtrack download, a strategy guide, a sticker sheet, and a cool inside box art with the reversible cover. So the Switch wins this one for me. SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom. After the longer load times on Switch, both versions are looking pretty similar. Looks like they're both running at 60 frames per second at first glance. But once we get into actual gameplay, the Switch gets cut right in half to 30 frames per second. And there's quite a bit of pop-in on both versions, but definitely more noticeable on the Switch. But now getting into Jellyfish Fields, it looks amazing on Steam Deck. And on the Switch version, there's an insane amount of pop-in. Standing at the same place in Jellyfish Fields, the draw distance is significantly lower on Switch. Some objects you can't even see, like those rocks rolling down the mountain. But multiplayer, it actually runs better than the main game. And it's obviously a point towards the Switch if you want to play local. But overall, the Steam Deck wins this one. Disco Elysium. When booting up the game, the resolution and frame rate are much higher on the Steam Deck. The shadows on the characters are also more crisp. And actually, the Switch version is chugging and is having a difficult time staying at a consistent 30 frames per second. When we get outside, you can see many textures are missing as well. The main pro for the Switch is that it comes with a little poster inside the physical case, but overall gameplay-wise, the Steam Deck version takes this one. Turnip Boy commits tax evasion. In this meme of a game, we should expect to see similar results due to the pixel art style. And yeah, Turnip Boy performs pretty much identical on both versions. The only thing being different is the slightly longer load times on the Switch, but honestly, it's identical. So play this game on whichever console you choose. House Flipper, the game you buy your son because you want him to do all the renovations in your house when you're older. Just in the home menu, you can see what's up. There's no grass, barely any shading, the textures on the house and garage are completely different, and the trees are different. The sky in the Switch version just looks like a static picture with clouds, where the Steam Deck version looks like an actual skybox. Just look! Even the poster is different inside. When checking the mail, it's completely different as well, and the text on the Steam Deck version look way better. This is horrible on Switch. At least the inside box art is kind of cool. Point for the Steam Deck. Forager. This game has a similar pixel art style, so this should be pretty close. In this Switch version, the roadmap, community, and modding options are missing, and the version is 4.1.3 on Switch and 4.1.9 on Steam Deck, but I don't really think there's much missing here. These are pretty much identical. If you like modding, then get the Steam Deck version. If you don't care, they're equal, unless there's some big update gameplay change that I just don't know about. Spyro Reignited Trilogy. When booting up the game, you can see a clear frame rate difference, with the Steam Deck running at 60 frames per second, 720p on high graphics, and the Switch version running at 30 frames per second. The resolution is also much lower on Switch, looking like it's just under 720p, and the textures are also way worse on Switch. The colors on the Steam Deck version are also much more vibrant, so if you want to try this game out, Steam Deck is probably the better option unless you want to hunt for a physical copy. Rocket League! First off, this game isn't officially on Steam, but you can run it using something like Heroic Launcher, or if you have Windows installed on your deck. The Switch version pre-wins this because it has Mario, Luigi, and Metroid cars. But looking at the graphical differences, the Steam Deck obviously looks better with the high resolution and solid locked-on frame rate at 60. The Switch is 30 frames per second, or if you choose to play at a higher frame rate on Switch, you can choose Performance Mode, which is rare to see on a Switch game. This gives the Switch a higher frame rate, but lower quality textures and resolution. The Switch version also has a noticeable lack of particle effects compared to the Steam Deck. But what makes the Switch superior is the fact you can have local co-op matches off and online. And although the resolution absolutely tanks, it stays at a consistent 60 frames per second with 2 players on the same screen. And of course, the Mario jump. Switch wins this one, hands down. Stranded Deep. The Steam Deck version is running at just above 30 at 720p, and the Switch version is running at a solid 30, but the resolution looks heavily lowered along with the textures and shadows. The water on Steam Deck version is superior, but the shadows on both versions are actually very glitchy. So the Steam Deck is a clear winner, but to be honest, this game isn't best on any handheld at all. Skyrim. When booting up the game on Switch, you can already see the game is running at 30 frames per second, but it's a smooth 60 on the Steam Deck. Just when looking around, it's much more comfortable on the Steam Deck version because the opening camera sensitivity is really high, and that makes it difficult to look around with the Joy-Con stick. The overall lighting is also much better on the Steam Deck, but for a game that's over 10 years old, you can't really see that many differences. The bright side for the Switch is that you can get Legend of Zelda gear, and you can even tap an amiibo. But of course, we need to talk about mods. The modding community for this game is so massive, and you can actually get almost all of them running on Steam Deck, adding so much value to the PC version. For this reason alone, this goes to Steam Deck. Divinity 2: Original Sin, the game that walked so Baldur's Gate 3 could run. The menus in this title are actually pretty graphically intensive, and right away you can notice the frame rate is lowered on Switch, and so is the resolution. It looks like it's running about 720 720p at 30 frames per second, but on the Steam Deck we get it running at 1080p, around 60 frames per second. Loading times were pretty similar, which was nice. Lighting effects definitely look better on the Steam Deck. That being said, it didn't look like anything was cut from the Switch version. So aside from the performance, they both play virtually identical and are great handheld games. So this one goes to the Steam Deck. Dying Light. Just in the main menu, we can see more of a depth of field blur on the Steam Deck. Turning off depth of field on the Steam Deck runs way better. We can also see the resolution is higher on Steam Deck because of these buildings with the anti-aliasing. And the smoke is a lot more clear with more contrast to it. Load times are also way faster, like pretty much every game in this video. And at 1080p medium settings, Dying Light on Steam Deck runs around 60 frames per second at 800p, like the deck is intended. But most of it is just resolution. Shadows are also more intense on the Steam Deck, and there's actually ambient occlusion. But I'm surprised to see that a lot of the textures weren't cut from the Switch, like this poster. Overall, there are less particle effects on the Switch. Like this smoking guy has no smoke, but there is smoke on the Steam Deck. The render distance is probably the most notable thing. Trees have more definition, and you can just see more stuff. Something cool about Dying Light on the Switch is the unique Switch features like all the DLC and some in-game tweaks that stand out, like HD Rumble. But yeah, Steam Deck is probably the best option between the two. My friend Pedro. Just in the menu alone, we can see the Switch version looks similar, but the resolution is definitely lower. For some reason, some textures, like on the bullets, the Switch make them look so muddy, and it's just a solid color. Load times are faster on Steam Deck, obviously. In gameplay, it appears that the reduced resolution on Switch makes the textures feel weak. If we look at this box, we can actually read the Made in China on Steam Deck, and not on Switch. Both games are running at 60 frames per second, which is uncommon for a Switch game. The gameplay and graphics are also extremely similar. There are just a few minor differences that I didn't even realize for a while, like the environmental lighting. When you shoot bullets on Steam Deck, the bullets light up the area around it, like the stairs and ground, which can really make a difference when there's many bullets flying around, which there often are. Same with the actual light fixtures in game. They're actually lit, but they don't light up the area around them on Switch. But that's pretty much it. And the Steam Deck is running at 1080p on high settings, and the Switch seems to be 720p, and it's also at 60. But they're both running at 60 frames per second. It plays great whichever console you choose, but it definitely looks better on Steam Deck. Train station renovation. If this is anything like House Flipper, I'm gonna be so angry. Oh, are you kidding me? The Switch version and Steam Deck version are completely different. Steam Deck actually looks decent. The rooms themselves are also completely different, but I have to say, the detail is pretty good on Switch. The lighting in the room on the Switch version looks decent, but everything else is, oh. The floor is different, the wallpaper is different, the windows are in the same spot, but the Switch version has better windows. The biggest difference is the map. Do I even need to say anything else? There's trees, textures, running water, and everything is better on the Steam Deck. The Switch is just a blob of green. The UI has also completely changed. Because the trackpad is used for the PC version, we're running into some handheld issues using the default controls. Anyways, let's actually get into the game, actually renovating. Right away, we can see some old man hands and a big UI difference. The icons are in a different space, the clouds actually move on Steam Deck, the draw distance on Switch looks like I'm on the end of the earth, and the Steam Deck has fog. The textures are also way better on the deck as well. The foliage is better with the grass and the moving trees. The trees even have shadows. It doesn't look like there's any shading on the Switch. Just look at the stones and dirt. The Steam Deck does chug a little bit at 30 frames per second at 1080p, but at 720p, it's a smooth 60. The Switch version does oddly seem like a higher resolution though. The Steam Deck is weirdly fuzzy. If you do, for some reason, want to play this, I recommend the Steam Deck with the mouse and keyboard. Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, the game with a physics-based combat system. As per usual, the frame rate is chopped on Switch and runs smooth on Steam Deck. There's also an added motion blur effect that adds a more cinematic look. The main difference with this game is the Switch doesn't have all the DLC and updates included. There's also a limited amount of people you can spawn on the Switch. Unlike the Steam Deck, there's also a lack of touchscreen support on the Switch, which is definitely something that would be useful in this game, and the Steam Deck works great with touchscreen. The Switch version just overall looks a lot more bland and is a lot more choppy. The only benefit of the Switch is really the multiplayer, but the other things outweigh it. So this one goes to the Steam Deck. Nickelodeon All-Stars Brawl 1. This fighting game is definitely one of them. There were some compatibility issues with the Steam Deck version, but the graphics didn't really change much between the two. Heck, the Steam Deck was actually a little more choppy, and with the Switch's ease of local multiplayer, hands down, play this on the Switch version. That's if you want to play this game at all. Of course, if you want to play this one, there's a second one out, but I didn't get it yet. Octodad, Dadliest Catch. I remember playing this game on my extremely old Mac Mini back in the day, so it can't be too hard to run, but which one runs better? Well, it seems like they're both identical. Graphics, frame rate, they're the same, so whichever version you get will be fine. Local multiplayer would be easier easier on the home console on Switch, so this goes to Switch in my opinion. Portal 1. It's finally on Switch after many years. Opening up Portal, in the title screen alone, there are some pretty big shading differences, like the shadows underneath these objects, and the shadows are a lot deeper as seen by the door. And oddly, the UI change in the menu. It feels a lot less polished on the Switch version, and they've replaced the Portal logo with blurred text for some reason. All the menus are different, but just by going to the first few chambers, everything is exactly the same except for the weak shadows on Switch. And the resolution is 1080p at 60 frames per second on both. So regardless of which version you choose, these are both pretty well identical. Now Portal 2. This game is a little more graphically intense than Portal 1, so it'll be interesting to see the differences. The menus are the same unlike the first one, but let's get into gameplay. Load times are better on Steam Deck as usual, but this time around the Switch now seemingly has identical shadows to the Steam Deck. The shadows might even be a tiny bit better, but this is nothing noticeable. Both versions are running at a solid 1080p 60 frames per second. It's really odd that the shadows appear so much better on Switch for Portal 2 than they did for Portal 1, since both of these games launched on Switch at the same time. The only real advantage of the Switch version though is the local co-op, which is fantastic in this game. So if you don't care about load times, then I definitely get the Switch version, but mainly for the multiplayer version alone. It Takes Two. This game is such a graphical masterpiece, but requires 2 players. After playing this on both devices, it's clear the overall performance and graphical fidelity is much better on the Steam Deck, but because of the somewhat complicated process of docking the Steam Deck and connecting multiple controllers, the Switch is much better in regards to multiplayer, especially considering how seamless the Switch can play local co-op games. And if another person has a Switch, you don't even need to play online. You can simply use a local wireless connection, which is exclusive to the Switch version. So even with the frame rate being cut and not looking as pretty, the Switch version runs good enough and is a great way to play multiplayer. So the Switch does win this one, but I have to say, if you have EA Play on the Steam Deck, you can practically play this game for only $5, as opposed to the full price at, I think, $40 on Switch. A short hike. Neither of these versions had any issues running. The only real difference was the option to select the minimum graphics setting on the Steam Deck, which might sound like an odd feature to praise, but it gives the game a unique pixelated look the devs intended. I'm not sure why the Switch can't do this as well. So yeah, the Steam Deck would be better unless you wanted to play the pixel option as intended by the devs. Steam Deck wins this one. Just Die Already. Just Die Already is an old person mayhem game. The biggest difference so far is the resolution. It's really low on Switch. There's a lot less details on the Switch version because of it. The Steam Deck runs a smooth 1080p 60 frames per second, and the Switch looks just under 720p, struggling to hit 60 frames per second. The shading overall is better on the Steam Deck as well, and almost entirely missing on Switch. But in some cases, the Switch version does have better draw distance, but I'm still giving this one to the Steam Deck. Kill It With Fire. This game is one where you walk around and kill spiders with wacky objects, like a gun. Well, these games are practically identical in terms of looks on both versions due to the extremely minimal graphics this game is giving us. However, the Steam Deck version runs at a much smoother 60 frames per second than the Switch does, so I'd play it on Steam Deck if you have that option. Nier Automata. Load times getting into the game are faster on Steam Deck as usual, and we can already tell the Switch is 30 frames per second as compared to the Deck's 45 frames per second at 1080p. So bringing the Steam Deck to the native resolution at 720p, it becomes a locked 60 frames. And we can see a big difference in the textures on the ground and the overall lighting effects on Switch. There's also more particle effects on Steam Deck. Just look at the combat moves. The game is extremely well optimized for the Nintendo Switch though, and has some exclusive in-game cosmetics, but the experience is much smoother on the Steam Deck, so play it on that. But it's a really good port on the Switch. Pixar, one of the worst rated games on Switch. Well, the frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second compared to the Steam Deck's at 60. Textures are lower on the Switch, and the UI is the same with minor tweaks to the Switch controller. And the deck has a weird WASD text I can't seem to get rid of. The shadows are surprisingly on Switch, and it actually looks pretty decent with dynamic shadows underneath all the creatures. But it has a chugging feel I can't quite explain. Definitely the Steam Deck version is better, but only with the mouse and keyboard, because it's a chore to navigate all the menus in the game with the controller. If you don't have a mouse and keyboard, the Switch version is playable, but you'll hate yourself. Crash Bandicoot 4. This is one of my favorite games of all time. The main differences between these two games is the fact the Steam Deck plays at double the frame rate and overall resolution is much better. But for some reason, the Switch version feels so great still. Even with the 30 frames per second and lacking resolution, they're both really snappy. But if you've played a Crash Bandicoot game, you'll know timing has to be precise. With 60 frames per second on the Steam Deck, that's the clear winner. Steam Deck wins that one. So here are the scores for each. Obviously the Steam Deck wins more. It is a more powerful system, but there are some really great things about the Switch. Now, if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and consider being a YouTube member. I'll see you in the next one. See you later.